The Australia 2020 Summit. Now, regardless of what you say about it being a select audience and so on, at the start of that summit, there was no mention of the Republic at all. The Republic wasn't an issue. It wasn't even in the paperwork when it first started. Now, by the end of the convention, when they did the summing up on the last day, the only item that got a standing ovation was the Republic. Now, you can argue with a bit of a biased audience or an elite audience or whatever, but even so, there was only one item that got a standing ovation. And it hadn't even been on the agenda to start with. Now, we like to claim some of the credit for that. Obviously not all the credit, but that's an amazing thing. So that it provided a bit of a springboard, and the government actually said that they were going to respond to all those issues from the 2020 summit by the end of the year. So we're on a promise to hear from the government something about, okay, what is their plans about this number one standing ovation issue. And of course we've been in consultation with the Prime Minister, or really his office, over that time, and if you want to ask, I'll tell you a bit more about that later. So there is you know, the opportunity is there, and we have to sort of seize the opportunity. Another challenge we've got is to try and get the Republican forces in Australia linked up on a central path, and that's a challenge in itself. So, and I think internally in our organisation, it's quite clear that we're a volunteer organisation. We have one paid employee, 3/5 paid employee, actually 3 days a week. So there's an awful lot of work done by a fairly small number of people. You know, and that means it takes time, and it means that we need to try, and if we're going to expand our activities, we need to attract more people who are prepared to contribute, because the people who are working now are pretty much, they've all mostly got families and jobs and kids and everything, and there's only a limited amount of time they can give to this movement. So we need to get more people involved if we're going to expand our activities. Doing those, trying to appeal to those groups or influence those groups, we're aware that we have to sort of look at also what our messages are, how we convey our messages. I mean, obviously Dave Donovan's, for those of you who read Republican Roundup, we've taken quantum steps in making our message presented more professionally in that way. And there's still steps we can take to improve. David's mentioned media and so on. There are a lot of mechanisms that our organisation needs to improve and perfect before we could actually campaign. Let's say the government put the agenda, this item on the agenda next year. We need to have an improved organisation, a wider spread organisation, and a more committed organisation to make the best case. We're not sitting pretty with a perfect organisation at the moment. So we've got internal work to do. And when they're all volunteers, there's only so many hours a day, it doesn't happen overnight. You've got to keep looking at it, you've got to keep the faith. So those were our sort of objectives. Now, I'll say one thing, we're working on what we should change next year, or what we should emphasise next year, and there will be a meeting of the National Committee, the newly elected National Committee, at the end of November, and these things will be finalised. But it's clear that the biggest change in our thrust will be that we need to re-emphasise and reinvigorate and sort of focus on forums, regional forums across Australia. That unless we have groups of people like this, essentially in every postcode, or every suburb, or every small town, we're going to get nowhere. Because the message from the politicians is quite clear. They're not going to take the lead. It's too hard. It might disadvantage them. When they've got people knocking on their doors, and when they can see that we've got support spread through the country, and that the people are interested, they might do it then. So I can't speak for the exact, I mean, I might not even be on the National Committee, so I obviously can't speak after the elections, but it's clear that the thrust is that we feel we've got to put a lot more emphasis onto getting people involved at the grassroots level, as David mentioned, and to have this sort of group replicated across the country, you know, hundreds of them is what we do. hundreds of them, not 300 or 400. So that will be the big shift, and we've got some other plans for ways of doing that, and some of them are reasonably well advanced. And I'll, if you want to ask me question time about that, I'll be very happy to expand on some of those. Like what our concept of having a bit of a relaunch of the organisation, grouped around a change of the logo and change of some of the messages and that sort of thing. So I'll expand on that in question time if you want to ask about it. Now, what can the ordinary member of the RM or ordinary people in the street do? I mean, firstly, I think we have to have a realistic idea of the fact that people don't have a lot of time to worry about these sorts of issues. Family people are focused on how much petrol costs and how many places there are in daycare, and how they're paying the mortgage. I mean, that's life in Australia. That's what we're here to protect. That's what we're here to improve. People are focused on that, and therefore there's not a lot of time left for what can be seen as fairly esoteric sort of endeavour. And often, not only our opponents, but lots of people say, there's higher priority issues, climate change, and a new one. What do we call it now? The GFC, the global financial crisis. There's all these issues, and it's all so hard that we really can't, and it all costs so much, and we really can't look at the Republican. My message that I've been trying to get across to the Prime Minister and others is that our national life should be about more than the bottom line. Now, when Mr. Howard and others say you need a sound economy or you go bust, well, I'm not going to argue that. What I'm saying is, we elect hundreds of people to Parliament in Australia. Surely some of them can have a look at this issue. We have millions of bureaucrats in Australia. They can't all be working on climate change. They can't all be working on the global financial crisis. What about a few work on the Republic? Not many. Half a dozen would be good. So to say that, we can't look at the Republic, can't examine the Republic, can't progress the Republic because we've got other issues, is just flying in the face of common sense, really. Because what are we saying? That any government can only ever handle 4 issues. There are going to be other things. And hopefully we can get people to acknowledge that progressing our nationhood, progressing our place in the world, progressing the intangible, even though it's not going to affect the bottom line in any way, is an important national goal. Now, not something that's going to happen overnight. It's not going to change the petrol prices. We have to acknowledge that. But it's worth doing, because if we believe in Australia, what are we doing? With some 80-year-old woman living 12,000 miles away, being the apex of our constitutional arrangements? It's crazy. What are we doing saying that a constitution that was written by 60 average Aussies over 100 years ago, who believed in the White Australia policy, that it doesn't need some changing? It defies logic, really. So, I think the sorts of things that people can do is obviously how we have my membership forms. If you're not a member, you can join the ARM. And that actually, other than the fact that people's membership fees gives us some resources to use for the sorts of things I'm talking about. Being a member is terrific. We've got our membership cards and we can talk to each other. But everyone can be interested in this issue. You don't have to be a member of the ARM. But people can inform themselves about the issues, and people have some weird and wonderful sort of ideas. I heard on the radio not too long ago, a lady rang in. I'm pretty sure she was a farmer's wife, but probably a terrific lady, probably heard the CWA in her area. But she was saying we couldn't possibly become a republic because in the army they'd have to replace all the plates. Did anyone hear that? Yeah, I'm not making this up. It'd just be far too expensive because the army would have to replace all their plates. Well, I've got news. Firstly, the only plates in Australia that have got the bloody Queen's crown on it is at Government House. Yeah. Right? That's the only plates. And secondly, even if we were replacing plates, we wouldn't be just throwing all the old plates out one day and having new ones next. Everything gets replaced.
Have a Queen's wedding. Yeah.